As you are listening to this deep dive right now, you are probably taking a few massive things for granted. You're making a fundamental assumption about the physical world around you.
Right, like an everyday, unquestioned truth.
Exactly. You are assuming that the floor beneath your feet, the chair you are sitting on, and the walls around you are solid.
Because that's what our senses tell us, right? I mean, we build our entire understanding of the universe on that physical tangibility.
Yeah, you knock on a wooden desk and it just feels incredibly dense. It feels impenetrable.
And our brains evolve to trust that solidity, just so we can navigate our lives without going completely crazy.
But today, we are going to take that core assumption and completely shatter it. And to do that, we're looking at this fascinating set of notes by Andrea Mignini on the history of atomic models.
Yeah, Minnie's notes they're really a brilliant roadmap. We'll be following his exact progression of arguments to basically deconstruct everyday reality piece by piece.
It's going to be a trip, because over this really frantic 70-year period, like late 1800s to early 1900s, science went through this conceptual earthquake.
Total paradigm shift.
Right. They transitioned from viewing the world as this tangible construction of physical bricks to, honestly, a nearly sci-fi theater of invisible forces.
It really does sound like science fiction when you break it down.
Okay, let's unpack this. Where does this grand illusion actually begin?
Well, we have to start with the historical baseline. So, early 1800s with a scientist named John Dalton.
Okay, John Dalton.
Yeah, Dalton provided a very practical model. He viewed atoms of different elements, things like argon, oxygen, calcium, as solid, indivisible spheres.
Like literally microscopic billiard balls.
Exactly like billiard balls, completely solid, completely full, and the only difference between them was their mass. So calcium is just a heavier, maybe slightly larger billiard ball than a hydrogen.
That sounds really intuitive, honestly.
It was, and for chemists weighing things on a scale, it worked beautifully.
But, and this is where I have to push back, there's a massive logical gap in Dalton's logic, right?
Oh, absolutely.
Because if they are just solid, immutable spheres bouncing around, what mysterious glue is actually holding them together to form water molecules or salt crystals?
Yes, that is the fatal flaw in his purely mechanical model. Dalton had absolutely no answer for the bonding mechanism.
Like they should just bounce off each other endlessly.
Right, like balls on a pool table. So the solution to this didn't come from chemistry at all. It came from an entirely different field, which was electricity.
Which is so interesting because back then, those were totally separate disciplines.
Completely separate. Until 1799, when Alessandro Volta invented the battery.
Ah, the voltaic pile.
Exactly. He proved that if you take mundane metals and put them in a chemical solution, that purely chemical reaction creates a constant, measurable electrical current.
Oh, wow. So that hints at a really deep structural bond between matter and electric force.
Precisely. If chemicals produce electricity, matter itself must be fundamentally electric. The secret engine wasn't mechanical hooks, it was electrical attraction.
Which brings us to Coulomb's law, right?
Yep. The classic dynamic of opposite charges attracting and, charges repelling.
But I mean, I look at my desk right now, and it doesn't shock me. It seems completely neutral.
And that's the trick. Objects only appear neutral to you because their internal positive and negative charges are engaged in this perfect microscopic tug of war. They cancel each other out perfectly.
So it's all balanced. But if electricity is the glue, the logical next step for scientists is to use electricity to basically pry the atom open.
Exactly. And that leads to some of the most bizarre Jules Verne-style laboratory setups in the 1860s to 1880s. They started using these things called Crookes tubes.
Oh, I've seen pictures of these. They look like elaborate sealed glass vacuum chambers.
Yeah, hooked up to early electrical generators, and the genius part here is the vacuum.
Right, because if you leave regular air in there, the air molecules are just too dense.
Exactly. Trying to observe subatomic phenomena through normal air would be like trying to sprint underwater. You just crash into the molecules.
So they pump the air out, they create this vacuum, and they apply a high current between a negative cathode and a positive anode.
And when they did that, this mysterious, eerie green fluorescence appeared in the tube. They called them cathode rays.
But a green glow doesn't really tell you what the ray actually is. I mean, it could just be light, like a neon sign.
Right. So to figure out if it was light or actual physical matter, they ran these brilliant investigative tests. First, they put a Maltese cross made of metal right inside the tube.
In the path of the beam.
Yep. And it cast a razor-sharp shadow on the glowing back of the tube.
Okay, so that proves the ray is traveling a perfectly straight line from the negative plate. But light casts a shadow too, right?
Exactly. A flashlight casts a shadow. So they needed a definitive test for mass. And they brought in the mill wheel.
This part is so wild.
It really is. They put a tiny, incredibly lightweight wheel on these miniature rails inside the vacuum tube. And when they fired the cathode ray, the ray physically spun the wheel and pushed it down the tracks.
See, that is deeply insane. That is like pointing a regular flashlight at a pinwheel and realizing the beam of light is literally hammering the blades to make it spin.
I mean, the moment that wheel spun, the debate was completely over. The ray had physical mass. And what's more, when they brought a negative magnet near it, the ray bent away from it.
It ran away from the negative charge.
Right, so it had a negative charge itself. And the craziest part, changing the gas inside the tube or swapping out the metal plates, none of that changed the ray.
So it wasn't just a quirk of one specific metal.
No. It meant this particle was a universal, standard building block of literally all matter in the universe. J.J. Thomson eventually coined the term for it, the electron.
The electron is born. And Dalton's indivisible billiard ball is officially shattered.
Completely shattered forever. But the scale of this new particle is what's truly mind-boggling. In 1909, Robert Millikan actually measured its charge and mass.
Right. I have the numbers here, and they're just absurd. To write down the electrical charge of an electron, you need 19 zeros after the decimal point.
It's incomprehensibly small.
And its mass requires 30 zeros. It is roughly 2,000 times lighter than a single hydrogen atom.
Which creates a massive theoretical crisis for the physicists at the time.
Because of the balancing act, right?
Exactly. If matter is naturally neutral, but it's filled with these tiny negative electrons, there must be a positive charge somewhere inside it to balance things out.
So enter Thomson's 1904 plum pudding model, or as Minnie calls it in his notes, the panettone model.
Yeah, it's a very soft, comforting Victorian idea. Thomson imagined the atom as this doughy sphere where the positive charge is just spread evenly throughout, like dough.
And the tiny negative electrons are just scattered inside it, like raisins in the pudding.
Exactly. But science loves to stress test these comforting ideas. So in 1911, Ernest Rutherford decides to essentially perform a violent ultrasound on this doughy atom.
Right. He used alpha particles, which are these heavy, incredibly fast, positively charged subatomic bullets, and he fired them at a microscopically thin sheet of pure gold foil.
And because these alpha bullets were so heavy and so fast, they were supposed to just pass straight through the soft positive dough without any resistance.
Like a hot knife through butter.
Exactly, and most of them did. They zipped right through.
But here's where it gets really interesting. Because suddenly, the data just breaks down.
Out of nowhere, about 1 in every 20,000 alpha particles didn't just get slightly deflected, they bounced violently backward.
That is physically unacceptable under the old rules. It's like firing an artillery shell at a piece of tissue paper and having it bounce back and hit you in the face.
Rutherford himself was completely stunned. He realized instantly that the soft dough theory was dead.
So what did he deduce?
He realized that 99.9% of the atom's mass and all of its positive charge was collapsed into an infinitesimally small, dense point in the exact center.
The discovery of the nucleus.
Yes. And Minnie's notes use this fantastic analogy to show just how unsettling these proportions are. Imagine the nucleus of an atom was enlarged until it was the size of a single hazelnut.
Okay, hazelnut.
Now you take that hazelnut and place it exactly at the center of the pitch in the San Siro football stadium in Milan.
Okay, so I have my hazelnut sitting right on the 50-yard line.
Right. If the nucleus is that hazelnut, the electrons, the negative raisins, would be orbiting way out in the highest tribunes of the concrete grandstands.
Wow.
And the space in between the hazelnut and the tribunes, absolute cosmic emptiness.
Just void.
Just void.
But wait. If the center is positive and the electrons in the tribunes are negative, why doesn't the whole stadium immediately collapse on itself due to attraction? I mean, the electrons should plummet straight into the nucleus.
It's a great question. The answer is a perfect, perpetual dance of speed and centrifugal force. The electrons are moving at such terrifying speeds that the outward centrifugal force of their orbit perfectly balances the inward pull of the attraction.
They're just balancing on a razor's edge to keep the atom from collapsing.
Exactly. And this totally rewrote how we understand the true identity of matter. because Dalton thought physical mass was the atomic passport.
Right, that calcium was just heavier than hydrogen.
But mass is just baggage. The true absolute ID card for any element is its atomic number, or Z, and that is the exact strict count of the positive protons locked inside that central hazelnut.
Okay, so iron is iron purely because it has exactly 26 protons.
Yes, and argon has exactly 18. If you change the proton count, you literally change the identity of the element.
So if the protons are the immutable soul of the atom, that means the electrons orbiting miles away are essentially just, well, they're just currency for chemical reactions.
That's the perfect word for it, currency. If an atom loses one of its electrons, it becomes a positively charged cation. If it gains an extra electron from a neighbor, it becomes a negative anion.
But throughout all these chaotic trades and chemical reactions, the nucleus remains completely untouched.
Yes, shielded by the void. But this beautiful binary system of protons and electrons introduced a tormenting math paradox for 20th century physicists.
The phantom mass problem.
Right, because protons are 1,836 times heavier than electrons. So the physicists figured, let's just count the heavy protons to get the atomic weight.
Okay, so take oxygen, it has 8 protons.
Right, so logically, it should have a mass of exactly 8 units, but when they put oxygen on a scale, it weighed 16.
Exactly double. Where is this massive phantom weight coming from?
Exactly. It couldn't be extra protons because that would change the oxygen into a different element, and it couldn't be extra electrons because they weigh basically nothing, and you'd need so many that the atom would have a massive negative charge.
Plus, whatever this extra mass was, it had no electric charge and was completely invisible to all their electromagnetic instruments.
A total ghost. Until 1932, when James Chadwick finally caught it. He bombarded a sheet of beryllium and literally knocked these massive invisible particles out of the nucleus.
The missing link.
The neutron.
The neutron. A massive particle with strictly zero electrical charge living in this tight, heavy embrace with the protons inside the nucleus.
So the math is finally solved. 8 positive protons plus 8 hidden neutral neutrons equals oxygen's measured mass of 6 times.
The atomic ledger was balanced, but of course, nature hates rigid standards.
Yeah, true.
Right. Frederick Soddy was studying radioactive decay, and he discovered what we call isotopes. The word comes from Greek, meaning same place.
Same place on the periodic table.
Exactly. They are basically chemical twins. They have the same number of protons, so they're the exact same element, but they have a different number of neutrons hiding in the nucleus. Okay, but if I breathe an isotope of oxygen that has extra neutrons, does it smell different? Will it explode or poison me?
No, absolutely not. Because chemistry happens entirely in the outer electron shell, the tribunes of the stadium. The neutrons are locked deep in the core. They have literally zero say in chemical reactions. Hydrogen, deuterium, tritium, they all have different neutron counts, but they make water the exact same way.
So what do the neutrons actually do then?
They dictate internal nuclear stability. Think of the nucleus like a tightly packed suitcase. You have all these intensely positive protons crammed together, and because repels, they want to blast each other apart.
Does the neutrons act as a buffer?
Exactly. They dilute the repulsion and hold the suitcase together. But if you force too many neutrons in or take too many out, the internal geometry gets weird. The zipper starts to break.
The suitcase is overstuffed.
Yes. And to find a better geometry, the nucleus becomes fundamentally unstable and partially disintegrates. It violently spits out fragments and pure energy just to relieve the pressure.
And that is radioactivity.
That is the exact mechanism of radioactivity. And it directly connects to human history through the carbon-14 clock.
Carbon dating.
Yeah. Normal carbon-12 is a perfectly stable suitcase, but the upper atmosphere constantly produces a tiny amount of carbon-14, which is an unstable isotope with 2 extra neutrons.
So it's an overstuffed suitcase.
Right. And you, me, all the plants and animals, while we are alive, we eat and absorb this tiny amount of carbon-14.
But once an organism dies,
it stops taking in new carbon-14, and those overstuffed suitcases trapped in the bones or the wood begin decaying at a mathematically perfect, inalterable rate.
Which allows archaeologists to date ancient relics with stunning precision. That is incredible.
It's a flawless atomic timer.
So what does this all mean? I mean, we've gone on this incredible 100-year journey following Minnie's notes. We started with Dalton's comforting, solid billiard ball.
Right, them completely full atoms.
And we ended up in a dizzying microcosm governed by powerful electric forces, inhabited by phantom electrons, where matter is 99.9% desolate empty space.
And that reality brings us to the final most mind-bending fact in the source material. It's the colossal illusion of touch.
Oh, wow. Okay. Let's hear it.
Well, think about what we just learned. Atomic nuclei are separated by massive gulfs of empty space, right? And the absolute outer limits of those atoms are just buzzing clouds of negative electrons.
Yeah, the tribunes of the stadium.
Exactly. So because negative violently repels negative, the rules of electrical repulsion are absolute. As you type on your keyboard right now or rest your elbows on the table, you are experiencing a sensory lie.
Wait, really? A sensory lie?
Yes, because your atoms are not physically touching the table's atoms. They cannot. The negative electron clouds of your skin are violently repelling the negative electron clouds of the object before the physical cores ever get close to each other.
Meaning you have never actually touched anything in your entire life.
Not a single thing.
That's crazy. So what we perceive as physical pressure,
Yeah.
that solid feeling of the desk, is just the violent, invisible electromagnetic repulsion between the electrons in our skin and the electrons in the object. You got it. So for everyone listening right now, as you sit there, you are literally levitating at a subatomic distance above your chair, completely sustained by invisible fields of force in a mostly empty universe.
It's the ultimate optical or tactile illusion.
Unbelievable. Well, I think that is the perfect mind-melting place to leave it for today.